Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this question. Can we really have economic growth without destroying the planet?
Well, it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds these days, and luckily there's a lot of great research happening trying to get us closer to the answer.
For today's deep dive, we're going to start with a paper called On Green Growth with Sustainable Capital.
Sounds promising.
And it comes from the University of Cambridge. But we're also going to widen our scope a bit and bring in some reports from E3G, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and the Climate Bonds Initiative.
Excellent. So maybe a good place to start would be to imagine this. We're trying to build a really successful economy, but without using up all of our natural resources.
Right, like, can we have both?
Exactly. And that's where this idea of green capital comes in.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is green capital?
Well, think of it this way. It's all of the natural things that make life possible in the first place. Like, we need the Amazon rainforest to breathe, right?
Right. I mean, I know we need trees for oxygen.
Well, it's more than just the oxygen. It's the whole rainforest ecosystem, all of the life there. That's just one example. We also need the oceans to regulate the climate and keep things stable.
Okay, yeah, and I guess fertile soil is another. Like, how do we grow food without good soil?
Exactly. So green capital is like this foundation that we all depend on.
Okay, I see. So that's the green capital. What about the stuff that we actually build? Where does that fit in?
Well, that's where the idea of man-made capital comes in.
Ah,
Things like factories, roads, all the infrastructure that we typically think of when we're talking about economic growth.
right. So the research looks at how these two types of capital, the green and the man-made, interact with each other.
Yes, and specifically, the Cambridge study tries to figure out how increasing one type of capital affects the other.
So what's the verdict?
Well, basically it shows that if we only focus on growing man-made capital without thinking about the impact on green capital, we're
Yeah.
going to be in big trouble.
Oh, that doesn't sound good. How much trouble are we talking about?
Well, the study found that for every 1% increase in man-made capital, without any corresponding investments in sustainability, we're likely to see a 0.7% decrease in green capital.
Well, that's a pretty significant drop.
It is, and it translates into some pretty serious consequences. We could see things like lower agricultural yields, water scarcity, and all sorts of other problems.
Yeah, it sounds like unchecked growth comes with a hefty price tag when it comes to the environment,
Yeah,
and ultimately a price tag for us.
exactly. But here's the good news. The research doesn't just point out the problem, it also offers some solutions.
Okay, well, that's a relief. I was getting a little worried there. So
Yeah.
what are the solutions?
Well, a big part of it has to do with the government policies.
Oh, so governments need to step up and do something.
Pretty much, yeah. And
Right.
one of the main tools they highlight is this thing called a carbon tax.
Carbon tax. That sounds familiar.
It's been getting more and more attention lately, and it's actually a pretty straightforward idea.
Okay, so how does it work?
Basically, you put a price on carbon emissions. So if a company pollutes more, they have to pay more. And that creates a financial incentive for them to switch to cleaner technologies and reduce their environmental impact.
So it's like hitting them where it hurts, their wallets, to encourage them to clean up their act? I kind of like it.
Yeah, a lot of people think it could be really effective. And this actually ties into a big point made by the E3G report, which is all about the huge investment gap we're facing to meet our climate and energy goals.
How big of a gap are we talking?
Well, they estimate that we need an additional 177 billion every year just in the EU to close the gap.
Oh, that's a lot of money. So where's all that money going to come from?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
It is.
And the E3G report suggests that public finance can play a huge role in attracting private investment.
So governments need to step up and invest first.
Well, it's more about sending the right signals and creating policies that will encourage businesses to see sustainable investments as worthwhile.
I can see that. If the government shows they're serious about tackling climate change, it might give businesses more confidence to put their money into green solutions.
Exactly. And both the E3G report and the Climate Bonds Initiative report really emphasize this need for clear standards and definitions in the world of sustainable finance.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're an investor, you want to know exactly what you're putting your money into. If it's all vague and confusing, it's a lot riskier.
Exactly. Clear rules and regulations are really important to make sure that investments are actually sustainable and are going to have a real positive impact on the environment.
Okay, so this is starting to feel like a bit of a puzzle.
Mm.
We need governments to take the lead, set clear standards, and make investments to attract private capital. And we need businesses to get on board and start innovating and finding cleaner ways to do things.
It's a complex puzzle for sure, but at least it's a puzzle we can solve.
I like that optimism. It's nice to know that there's at least a possibility of getting this right.
There is. And another interesting thing that Cambridge research looks at is this idea of investing in pollution abatement technology.
Ooh, what is that?
Well, think of it this way. Instead of just trying to use less energy or produce less stuff, what if we could actually develop technology that reduces or eliminates pollution at the source?
So like making our factories and power plants cleaner.
Yeah, but it goes even beyond that. Imagine more efficient solar panels that generate more energy from the sun, electric cars that run on completely renewable energy sources, or even biodegradable packaging that breaks down naturally instead of filling up landfills.
Okay, so we're talking about innovations that could really change how we produce and consume things.
Mm.
But what about the pollution that comes from everyday life? Things like driving cars, using energy at home, or just the stuff we buy.
That's a great point. And actually, the Cambridge research dives into that too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They looked at what would happen if consumption, rather than production, is the main driver of pollution.
And what did they find?
Well, they suggest that in that case, we might need different policy solutions.
So instead of just focusing on carbon taxes on production, we might need to consider taxes on consumption.
Exactly.
I see. But that seems kind of tricky, doesn't it? Like, taxing things that people use every day could make life a lot more expensive.
You're right. It's a delicate balance. We have to find ways to shift behavior without placing unfair burdens on people who are already struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually reminds me of something from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report. They talk a lot about this idea of behavior change and making sustainable choices more appealing.
That's so important. It's not enough to just rely on taxes and regulations. We need to create a culture where sustainable practices are seen as something positive and beneficial.
Okay, I like that. So it's not about making people feel guilty or forcing them to change. It's about showing them how making sustainable choices can actually improve their lives.
Exactly. It's about highlighting the benefits, like saving money on energy bills, reducing waste, and supporting local businesses. It's about making sustainability something that people actually want to do, not something they feel like they have to do.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not just about economic models and policy tools. It's about changing mindsets and building a society that genuinely values sustainability.
You got it.
But before we get too carried away with all this optimism, I want to go back to the Cambridge research for a minute. They mentioned this thing called welfare loss, and it sounds kind of ominous.
It is a pretty sobering concept. Basically, it refers to the cost to society from environmental damage.
So, like, how much pollution actually costs us.
Exactly. And not just in terms of money, but also in terms of health, quality of life, and even economic productivity.
Okay, so they're not just saying that pollution is bad. They're actually putting a price tag on the consequences of unsustainable practices. And I'm guessing those numbers are pretty scary.
They can be, yeah. And the research shows that those costs are only going to increase the longer we wait to take action.
Okay, that's a powerful message. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm starting to get a much better grasp of just how complicated this whole issue of sustainable development really is.
It is complex, but I think we're making some progress in untangling it.
I think so too. And I'm feeling a little more hopeful than I was before. It seems like there are some solutions out there, and that we might actually be able to make a difference.
Me too. It's not going to be easy, but I think a sustainable future is possible if we're willing to make the necessary changes.
I like to hear that. And this brings up a really important question for our listeners. Where do WE fit into all of this? What role can each of us play in creating a more sustainable future?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely be diving into in our next segment.
Stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started.
As I was looking through these reports, something really stood out to me.
Oh, what's that?
Just how tricky it's going to be to actually put these sustainable solutions into practice. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right. It makes sense that different countries and regions would face their own unique challenges.
Exactly. And even when you look at a specific policy like the carbon tax, there are different schools of thought about how to make it actually work.
Oh, interesting. So even with a policy like a carbon tax, which seems pretty straightforward, there are different perspectives.
Definitely. For instance, that Climate Bonds Initiative report we talked about, the one focusing on the UK,
Yeah.
well, They bring up some possible downsides to a carbon tax. They're concerned that it could actually hurt the UK's ability to compete economically if it's not designed really carefully.
How so?
Well, they point out that if businesses in the UK have to deal with these high carbon prices while their competitors in other countries don't, it puts them at a real disadvantage.
Yeah, that seems unfair. It's like they're being penalized for trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the report warns that it could lead to some companies losing market share or even just moving their operations to countries with less strict environmental rules.
Oh, I see. So then the emissions wouldn't actually be reduced. They'd just be happening somewhere else.
Right. And the report calls that carbon leakage. It's like you're trying to squeeze a balloon.
Oh, yeah, the air just moves to a different part of the balloon.
Exactly. So they stress that a carbon tax should be part of a bigger, more comprehensive policy package, one that includes things like support for businesses that are trying to transition to a less carbon-intensive way of doing business.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about punishing companies that pollute. It's about giving them the tools and support they need to change.
Exactly. And another thing they emphasize is international cooperation.
Right, because what's the point if one country goes green but everyone else just keeps polluting?
Precisely. It's a global problem that needs a global solution.
This whole discussion makes me think back to that investment gap that the E3G report highlighted. It seems like so much of this comes down to finding the money to make these changes happen.
That's a huge part of it. Attracting capital for sustainable investments is absolutely crucial.
So how do we do that? How do we convince investors to put their money into green projects?
Well, one of the biggest obstacles is that many investors see sustainable investments, especially in developing countries, as just too risky.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to predict what's going to happen in some of those places.
Exactly. So the E3G report lays out some ways to reduce those risks and make these investments more appealing.
Well, like what?
Well, things like government guarantees and financial insurance, it's basically a way for governments and development banks to step in and share some of the risk with private investors.
Okay, so it's like giving them a safety net.
Exactly. And they also talk about how important it is for public banks to sort of lead the way and show that these sustainable investments can actually be profitable.
I can see how that would make a difference. If governments are willing to put their own money on the line, it might encourage others to follow suit.
Exactly. And it seems like this is a recurring theme. Governments have a pretty big role to play in all of this, don't they?
Yeah, I'm definitely picking up on that. It seems like they have the power to make a real difference, both by setting regulations and incentives and by putting up the money to get things going.
You're right, and that's something that comes up again and again in all of this research.
Speaking of research, I remember that the Cambridge study looked at this fascinating scenario.
Huh.
What if we had a technology that could completely eliminate pollution?
Oh, yeah, that was a fun thought experiment.
So they're not saying that such a technology actually exists right now.
Right. No, it was more of a what-if scenario they used in their model to see what would happen. They called it pollution abatement technology, and it basically imagined a world where we could magically make pollution disappear.
Okay, I'll play along. Let's say we did have this magical technology. What would happen?
Well, it would completely change the game. Basically, the conflict between protecting the environment and growing the economy would just vanish. We could continue to develop and grow without harming the planet.
Whoa, that sounds amazing, but also kind of unrealistic.
It is, but I think it highlights the potential for technological innovation to help us solve these really tough problems.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that technology can be a powerful force for good.
Exactly. And the research suggests that investing in research and development, particularly in clean energy and carbon capture, could be a real game changer.
Okay, so it's not just about using less or doing less. It's about creating new ways to do things that are cleaner and more sustainable.
Exactly. And that ties into this whole concept of a green economy that we keep hearing about.
Right. A green economy.
It's about moving away from our current model, which relies on using up resources like there's no tomorrow, and shifting towards something more sustainable and equitable.
Hold on a second. What does equitable have to do with all of this?
Oh, that's a really important point, and it's something that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report really emphasizes. Sustainable development can't just benefit the wealthy few. It needs to be inclusive and benefit everyone.
Yeah, of course. What's the point of a clean planet if only a small percentage of the population gets to enjoy it?
Exactly. The report argues that sustainable development needs to address issues of social justice.
Okay, so it's not just about environmental sustainability. It's about creating a more just and fair society overall.
Exactly. It's about understanding that all these challenges are interconnected and finding solutions that address them holistically.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the role of governments, the need for more investment, and the potential of technology. But what about us, the everyday people? What can we do to be part of the solution?
Ah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And it's easy to feel like our individual actions don't really matter when we're talking about these huge global challenges.
I know what you mean. But actually, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report makes a pretty convincing argument for the power of individual choices.
Really?
Yeah. They talk about how even small changes multiplied by millions of people can have a huge collective impact.
Okay, I like that. So what kind of changes are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Well, it could be anything from simple things like being more mindful of your energy use at home to supporting businesses that are committed to sustainability.
So it's about being a conscious consumer and making choices that align with our values.
Exactly. And reducing food waste is a big one. That's something we can all do.
Definitely.
And choosing sustainable products whenever possible or opting for public transportation or cycling instead of driving, every little bit helps.
Okay, so those are all things we can do in our daily lives. But is there anything else we can do to make a bigger impact?
Absolutely. The report also talks about the importance of getting involved in your community and speaking up for policies that support sustainable development.
Oh, you mean like contacting our elected officials and letting them know that we care about these issues?
Exactly. Or supporting environmental organizations that are working to make a difference.
Okay, I like that. It's empowering to think that we can actually do something to influence change.
We can. But let's be realistic for a minute. There are always going to be people who resist change, right?
Yeah, that's true.
People who maybe don't believe in the science of climate change or who just aren't willing to change their lifestyles.
It can be frustrating.
It can. But the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report acknowledges that this resistance is going to happen, and they emphasize the importance of addressing the root causes of that resistance.
So instead of just telling people they're wrong, it's about trying to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. Because sometimes resistance comes from a lack of information or understanding.
Oh, yeah,
And sometimes it's rooted in economic anxieties, like worries about job losses.
I can see that.
So it's about having those conversations, providing accurate information, and showing people that sustainable solutions can actually benefit them in the long run.
Okay, so it's about building bridges and trying to find common ground.
Exactly. Because ultimately, we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Okay, so we've talked about governments, businesses, and individuals. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't really talked about yet. Technology. What role does technology play in all of this?
Ah, yes. The great technological fix. It comes up a lot in these discussions.
So are they saying that technology is the answer to all of our problems?
Well, some people believe that. They argue that we'll just invent our way out of climate change and resource scarcity.
So we should just sit back and wait for some magical invention to come along and save the day.
Well, not everyone agrees with that approach. Others argue that technology alone isn't enough.
Right, because even the coolest new gadget won't change the world if we don't change our behavior.
Exactly. It's not an either-or situation. It's about finding the right balance between technological innovation and other solutions.
Okay, so technology can be part of the solution, but it's not a silver bullet.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that technology isn't inherently good or bad. It all depends on how we use it.
That's a really good point. It's up to us to make sure that technology is used for good and that it helps create a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And that means asking the tough questions, being critical thinkers, and not just blindly accepting whatever new gadget comes along.
Speaking of tough questions, I'm curious to know more about how the Cambridge research actually quantifies the cost of inaction. How do they put a dollar amount on something like environmental damage?
That's a really important part of their work. They use their economic model to estimate the negative impacts of pollution on things like health, productivity, and the services that ecosystems provide.
So they're not just saying pollution is bad. They're showing us exactly how much it's costing us in very real terms.
Right. And their model makes it clear that those costs can be huge, especially over the long term.
It's like a warning sign saying, hey, if we don't deal with these issues now, it's going to cost us a lot more later.
Exactly. And it's not just about the financial costs. We're talking about damage to our environment, potential social unrest, and a decline in overall well-being.
Okay, so the stakes are pretty high. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to that question about individual action. What can we do to make a difference?
I think the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report sums it up really well. Ultimately, it comes down to our choices and our willingness to make changes in our own lives.
So we're not powerless in all of this.
Absolutely not. And it's not about being perfect or doing everything perfectly. It's about taking small steps in the right direction.
It sounds like a long journey.
It is, but it's a journey that we need to take together.
Well said. And speaking of journeys, I think it's time for us to take a little break. But stick with us because in our final segment, we'll delve deeper into this idea of individual action and the role of long-term thinking.
One thing that really struck me as we were going through all this research is just how much emphasis they put on long-term thinking.
It seems like short-term thinking is what got us into this mess in the first place.
Exactly. And the researchers at Cambridge really hammer this point home when they talk about how the choices we make today can have long-lasting consequences down the road. Their model actually shows how doing things unsustainably can gradually lead to a decline in well-being over time.
So it's like we're slowly but surely using up all of our planet's resources, both the natural ones and the economic ones.
Exactly. And what's scary is that we might not even notice the costs right away. We could be enjoying all these short-term benefits without realizing that we're setting ourselves up for trouble in the future.
It's like racking up debt on a credit card.
Perfect analogy. It feels good in the moment, but eventually, those bills come due.
And the longer you wait to pay them off, the more you end up owing.
Exactly. So how do we break out of this cycle of short-term thinking, especially in a world that's all about instant gratification?
That's a good question.
Well, the report from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network has some interesting ideas. They talk about shifting our focus away from just GDP growth and towards a broader definition of well-being.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before. It seems like GDP has become the ultimate measure of success, but it doesn't really tell the whole story.
It doesn't. GDP only measures economic output. It doesn't tell you anything about social equality, environmental health, or people's overall happiness.
It's like judging a dinner party based on how much food people ate.
Yeah. You could have a table full of empty plates, but it doesn't mean anyone actually enjoyed the meal.
Exactly. So the report is saying that we need to start valuing things that aren't so easily measured.
Right. Things like clean air and water, a sense of community, a feeling of connection to nature, those are the things that really contribute to a thriving society.
I agree, but how do you actually measure something like happiness? It seems pretty subjective.
It is. But there's actually a growing field of research focused on developing ways to measure well-being. They're looking at things like life satisfaction, social connections, and access to green spaces.
So it sounds like we're starting to develop the tools we need to move beyond just GDP and embrace a more well-rounded view of progress.
Exactly. And that's really exciting. It opens up the possibility of creating a world where economic growth goes hand in hand with social and environmental well-being, not one at the expense of the others.
Okay, I'm convinced. But let's be real. Changing the way we measure progress is a huge undertaking. It's going to require a major shift in thinking.
It is. But the Sustainable Development Solutions Network report points to some encouraging signs. For one thing, more and more people are starting to realize that GDP isn't the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. Even some economists are starting to question the whole idea of endless economic growth.
Exactly. And there are also some really cool examples of countries and cities that are already experimenting with alternative ways of measuring progress.
Oh, wow. So this isn't just a theoretical idea, it's actually happening.
It is, and that's what makes me hopeful. It shows that change is possible. We've spent a lot of time talking about the challenges of sustainable development, but what about the opportunities?
Oh, yeah. It's easy to get caught up in all the doom and gloom, but there's got to be a silver lining somewhere.
There is. Think about all the amazing innovation and entrepreneurship that's happening in the clean energy sector, sustainable agriculture, and all those green technologies.
That's true. We're seeing so many exciting new developments in those areas.
And these industries are not only good for the planet, they're also creating jobs and economic opportunities.
Okay, so it's not all about sacrifice. It's about building a better future, a future that works for everyone.
Exactly. The shift towards a sustainable economy is our chance to create a world that's more just, equitable, and prosperous for all.
I love that. That's a message I can really get behind. And I think it's the perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we?
We have. From economic models and government policies to the power of individual choices and the potential of technology.
It's been quite a journey, and I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this deep dive informative and inspiring. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the world of knowledge.